Warrior or healer? What do I want to be?
We've all heard of scientists in laboratories, but a Swami scientist in an ashram laboratory, experimenting with yoga for over 40 years.
That's unusual, isn't it? What is more unusual is that this was way back in the early 1900s. At that time, even in India, yoga was an obscure, mystical, very secretive practice.
Swami Kuvalayananda. Well, he and his associates did not invent the kind of yoga that has become a global phenomenon. But their intensive research in the ashram lab and then publishing the research results for decades made it possible for this kind of yoga to be invented. They used microscopes, X-ray machines, blood pressure gauges to discover and establish the hidden laws of the universe.
Kuvalayananda wanted to show the 20th century world that yes, it works. Yoga works.
Kuvalayananda was born as Jagganath Gune in Davoi, Gujarat. Not much is known about his parents, except that Gune was orphaned at the age of 14. Much later, and after many requests, he wrote his brief autobiographical stretch, in which he says, "Born of poor parents in 1883, I had to depend on public and private charity for my secondary education."
His high school education was in Pune, and Sanskrit was his favorite subject in school. His Sanskrit teacher in school was called Vinayak Rao Apte. Apte was a master teacher. It's probably because of Apte that Gune developed a keen interest in Sanskrit literature. From the epics to poetry to drama, this strong foundation in Sanskrit would later help him delve deeply.
At 20, Gune was a young man of limited means and insufficient resources and a late starter. But he was bright and he received a scholarship to study in the University of Baroda. India was under colonial rule then, and most universities were hotbeds of the nationalistic freedom movement. Gune wasn't particularly political, but it was almost impossible for any young Indian student to ignore the calls of the freedom movement. Young Jagganath Gune found that call for freedom irresistible.
That was their battle cry. More than that, it was an expression of pain for a long sought after dream. A dream of freedom for India.
It was a period when young people all over India were engrossed with the idea of a revolution.
But a nagging question troubled Gune. What kind of physique should one possess? And what kind of weapons had to be mastered to become a true revolutionary? Gune was not looking at throwing bombs at the colonial regime, but an inner voice was telling him to fight from a position of strength. A strong body, accompanied by an iron will.
He started looking around critically, searching, but could not find a master of the science of weapons, a master of the art of war. Then, as if by coincidence, he came across a news clipping about a master known as Professor Rajaratna Manik Rao. Manik Rao was an expert in handling traditional weaponry.
Manik Rao's training center was known as Jumma Dada Vyama Mandir. This was in the princely state of Baroda, not influenced completely by the colonial rule. Surprisingly, Professor Manik Rao was also a bone setter, an expert in Unani traditional medicine, and an adept in the practice of asanas. It was on 7th July 1907 that Manik Rao formally accepted Jagganath Gune as his disciple.
Manik Rao's gymnasium was run like a monastery. Students did not have to pay but would be allotted specific duties. So it was like a seva or service in exchange for tuition. Gune was placed in charge of the gymnasium's correspondence, drafting replies, requests for funds, writing articles and press releases for magazines. He would later become a prolific writer, writing yoga-related articles in journals and many books. And of course, many letters with requests for funds for the institution that he would later set up.
The daily routine at the gymnasium would be rigorous both for the master and his students. Manik Rao would rise by 4 am in the morning and give individual lessons to his students till about 8 am. Then, after breakfast, the work of bone setting for patients from outside would start. Afternoons were again devoted to the art of wrestling and weaponry. The students went through a cycle of observation and practice. Observation and practice. Any theory instruction was immediately combined with practice, and it was different for each student. It was a Gurukul system of education with the classroom and playground fused into one.
Manik Rao was not only a master of martial arts, but a legendary healer as well. Yogic asanas were a part of the warrior training to stretch the body and make it flexible, supple. Manik Rao would prescribe a regimen of yogic asanas to ailing patients as a treatment, while student Gune keenly observed. Gune was impressed. This was his first-hand experience of the efficacy of yoga asanas as an instrument of medical intervention. There were some very personal, direct experiences too. Gune himself suffered frequently from cough, cold, flu, and severe migraine headaches. Many years back, the doctors had told him that it was a constitutional problem, a chronic problem, that his constitution was delicate and he had to be careful. But Manik Rao had assured him, do the yogic exercises regularly and you will be completely healed. This happened. Gune started feeling well. His body became strong and he was able to handle the strenuous weapons training. The once fragile Gune could do 100 push-ups and could run many miles.
The molding of the student through observational inference and direct personal experience had begun.
Warrior or healer? What do I want to be? Gune asked himself repeatedly. He had arrived at Manik Rao's doorstep to train as a warrior. And here he was, getting deeper into the practice of yoga asanas and being drawn towards the analytical study of the yogic texts. The process of transformation of Jagganath Gune had begun.
Jagganath Gune's life had changed. He had become a disciple of Manik Rao to be a warrior and participate in the freedom struggle of India.
But here he was, practicing and studying yoga, amazed with his direct experiences with the tradition. His passion was to bring yoga to the mainstream as a healing practice, a life-changing practice. The period between 1910 and 1919 was a time of exploration and experimentation for Gune.
Around 1913, he shifted to Amalner to work for the Khandesh Education Society. His spirit of nationalism was still alive.
He introduced various types of traditional physical exercises and tried hard to introduce an indigenous culture among the students. He is said to have set himself 3 goals. First, to prepare the young generation for the service of the country. Second, to master the Indian system of physical education and integrate it with general education. And third, to bring together modern science and the science of yoga.
Gune lived like a monk, an ascetic. He had built himself a hut surrounded by a garden with a peacock and a deer. His hut was named Kaivalyadhama. Many spiritual seekers and philosophers came to his hermitage. There were discussions on Indian philosophy and scriptures, analysis of the yogic texts and dialogues on the nature of the universe. There were exchanges about the sutras and reviews of Sanskrit shlokas.
Among the regular visitors were professors from the Indian Institute of Philosophy in Amalner. This institute had a quarterly journal named Tattvajnana Mandira, the Temple of True Knowledge. This journal provided Gune with the inspiration for his own Yoga Mimamsa journal.
The first copy of this journal was dated 1917. It was conceived in his little hut called Kaivalyadhama. The hut was a miniature yoga research laboratory where initial scientific studies were started. These studies led to certain conclusive findings.
Then came a major turning point in Gune's life, a triggering event which changed his life further.
That trigger was the great yogi Paramhans Madhav Ji Maharaj.
Madhav Ji was from the eastern part of India, from Bengal. He was born in a family who were devout followers of the Bhakti tradition. Madhav Das represented the four major schools of philosophy: Bhakti, Advaita, Vishishta Advaita Vedanta and Dvaita Vedanta. He held extensive knowledge of sacred and secret practices, yet the objective closest to his heart was the spiritual upliftment of the people.
Madhav Ji shaped the direction of Swami Kuvalayananda's work for the next 50 years.
Jagganath Gune met him at Malsar, Gujarat in the year 1919. Madhav Das was 80 years old. He had settled down on the banks of the Narmada river. He had dug his own cave in the ground, a small space where he could sit for many hours in meditation without being disturbed by changes in the light, temperature or by wild animals.
Above the cave, at ground level, there was a temple. It is here that he had begun to teach the secrets of advanced yogic practices to selected disciples. This is where Gune met him.
Not much is known about that first meeting, but between 1919 and 1920, Gune kept coming back to receiving teachings from Madhav Ji.
Instruction and interaction went on side by side. It is believed that Madhav Das initiated Gune into the higher practices of yoga.
The rationalist in Gune could hardly have accepted anything without questioning persistently. There is a story about Gune asking Madhav Das, "Can you show me a real yogi in a state of samadhi?" And Madhav Das says, "Yes. Come tomorrow evening, after sunset." It was a full moon night. That night, Madhav Das took Gune in a small rowboat to the other side of the Narmada River, a densely forested part. They walk into the forest, and Madhav Das stops and points in a direction. "Gune, look there." Gune looks, and he is amazed by what he sees. There is a figure, a man with matted hair, sitting still, closed eyes, in a state of samadhi, total absorption.
Madhav Ji pointed his disciple towards a clear goal.
Make people and society aware of this system. Yoga will benefit all.
So, it was after 1920 that yoga became the prime pursuit of Gune. He assumed the name of Swami Kuvalayananda. This name came out of the many Sanskrit texts he had studied in college.
Swami Kuvalayananda had recognized that yoga can help human beings to evolve to higher levels.
With long practice, it was clear to him that it was a science, and it was completely experiential. His experiences proved what was mentioned in the yogic texts. He wrote phenomena, physical and mental, that an average man is not able to induce came slowly under my control.
He saw yogins and consulted yogic literature. He talked to eminent medical men and consulted books on psychology and physiology. But he could not find any scientific explanation of his experiences. He found that modern sciences, especially physiology, had nothing to say about this phenomena, and the yogins knew nothing of the modern sciences. There were a few articles published in the East and the West, but they were mostly speculative, not scientific.
Kuvalayananda was disappointed. His search for scientific validation of yogic facts was not yielding results. But then a whole process of study and research unfolded itself before him. The possibilities were extremely inviting. The idea of scientific research in the field of yoga kept haunting him night and day.
As the director of physical culture in Khandesh Education Society, he had access to certain resources. He had students as subjects, access to a basic laboratory, and many friends and sympathizers. Swami Kuvalayananda collected about 5,000 rupees, got an X-ray machine, a few X-ray experts, and conducted his first experiments on the digestive tube. Yogic exercises were studied under X-ray. The results were very encouraging. These research results were shown to Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore and scientist Jagdish Chandra Bose. They reacted favorably.
However, there were many skeptics among the scientists. They said yoga was no more than what some people felt by the way of subjective experiences. Swami Kuvalayananda faced many taunts from these scientists, but he stood firmly rooted in his conviction. He kept practicing and investigating.
Even then, his mind was troubled. The vastness of the work to be undertaken and the smallness of his means and stature bothered him. It needed a lot of courage to proceed on this ambitious path. He made up his mind by proposing to found an ashram and an institute devoted to this work.
Kuvalayananda resigned from Khandesh Education Society in 1923. The educator of Amalner, Jagganath Gune, had become Swami Kuvalayananda, the path-breaking researcher and practitioner of yoga in Lonavala. The small hut in Amalner called Kaivalyadhama was founded as a big hermitage in Lonavala in 1924.
And so it came to pass. It was 90 years back. Kaivalyadhama, meaning the abode of liberation, was founded in Lonavala. Founded by Swami Kuvalayananda.
Swami Kuvalayananda had the difficult task of making science conform to spirituality. He wanted to reveal the basic universal truth manifest in yoga by demystifying it through science.
He wanted to challenge the exclusionary teaching of the so-called occultists and recover what he regarded as pure yoga.
Where was this pure yoga? Well, it was manifest in the classical texts and in the teachings of his master, Madhav.
Now, at that time, there were hardly any institutions that taught yoga formally, even as a physical exercise. This ancient and mystical science had not stepped into the modern academic environment.
Kuvalayananda had already designed the framework for the institution. The blueprint was ready. The ideals, the work procedure, the financial requirements, and purpose of the project were well defined. It was a combination of Western and Eastern thought and culture. The ideal was to work out a philosophy that would provide maximum benefit to humanity.
There were to be libraries, laboratories, and hospitals, research staff and research subjects, yogic therapy providers and patients, teachers and students, classrooms and outreach programs. And the vehicle for communication for all this, the Yoga Mimamsa Journal.
The June 1924 issue of the journal Yoga Mimamsa states that the research work so far led to certain conclusions.
First, the yogic system of physical culture resulted in the highest physical efficiency, maximum brain power, and extended longevity.
Second, yoga as a system of preventive exercises keeps the whole nervous and glandular system in the healthiest condition. Third, yoga as a system of therapeutics is capable of curing chronic diseases and even mental disorders.
The years from 1924 to 1930 were hectic. Swami Kuvalayananda single-handedly became the fundraiser, the research director, the teacher, the presenter, the writer-publisher, and the therapist.
Swamiji approached the princely states. Wealthy individuals made magic lantern presentations at major institutes, met important people, and wrote innumerable letters seeking assistance.
It must have been very, very difficult.
It was in 1935 when I started teaching. There were very few books. For example, in Bombay, at that time it was called Bombay Presidency, which was from Rajasthan to South India. There were only 5-6 yoga teachers.
Swami Kuvalayananda had to tread the fine line between accepting small donations from many different people along with the effort that goes with it, or surrender the autonomy of the institute for substantial funds and grants. He chose the former.
Yale and Harvard universities approached him with offers of help. However, the research would have to be based in the United States.
The research direction would have to primarily focus on the therapeutic benefits. Kuvalayananda refused. The research would be based in India and would expand to science and classical Sanskrit literature.
4 events had helped the fund situation of Kaivalyadhama initially. First was when some friends of Kuvalayananda came forward to bear the costs of initial research work. Second was the donation of a generous 5,000 rupees from Sri Pratap Seth, who was the founder of the Institute of Philosophy in Amalner. Third was the yearly grant of 3,000 rupees from the Maharaja of Porbandar.
And lastly, Lalaji Gokuldas, an advocate of Bombay High Court, donated a plot of land in Borivali, now a suburb of Mumbai. There were many others who helped.
Some of the first experiments conducted at Kaivalyadhama were focused on the effects of pranayama. Kuvalayananda was trying to establish the relationship between the subtle and gross features of physiology.
Swami Kuvalayananda and others conducted experiments on brain waves, pulse rates, and blood pressure to discover the subtle flow of prana in the gross bodily functions. The focus was on the subtle, as laid out in the yogic texts. And Kuvalayananda and his team tried to establish the subtle through its relationship with the gross. They were designing experiments that would make the invisible visible.
Here was a man who had taken his analysis away from the inherently bounded ideas of Indian philosophy and spirituality into the domain of the modern conditions of life.
Swami Kuvalayananda was a tireless worker. Between 1924 and India's independence in 1947, he had made his work known to major nationalist leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, Lala Lajpat Rai, and many others. Gandhi had approached him for treatment. His work attracted the attention of a few researchers in the United States and in Eastern Europe. People came from Columbia and Yale universities, from the universities of California and Colorado. They came from Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences and the Medical University of Budapest. They found an atmosphere of quiet culture and scholarship at Kaivalyadhama. They described Swami Kuvalayananda with his long white corkscrew hair, white walrus mustache, and round-rimmed glasses on penetrating eyes as radiating an air of saintliness.
In 1934, the government allotted a plot of land in Mumbai for a yogic health center. Over the years, thousands of people benefited from the training and the therapy facilities.
The GS College of Yoga and Cultural Synthesis came into being in 1951 as a result of a substantial donation from a wealthy individual.
Initially, there was a 2-year course leading to the Diploma of Yoga Pravishta. A student of the 1957 batch, currently the Secretary of Kaivalyadhama, Sri O.P. Tiwari, asked Swami Kuvalayananda once, "Why does it have to be a diploma, Swamiji, after such a rigorous postgraduate level of study?" Kuvalayananda replied, "You cannot be more than that in the field of yoga in 2 years."
The Swami scientist educator carried on with his experiments in an ashram laboratory, trying to prove that yoga is real.
As Joseph Alter writes in his book Yoga in Modern India,
Yoga was not simply modernized by Swami Kuvalayananda. Yoga was analyzed in such a way that it has come to harmonize with the modernity manifest in science to create an alternative. And to a large extent, it is this harmonic hybridity that has enabled yoga to colonize the West.
Swami Kuvalayananda passed away in 1966. He left a message on the blackboard in his bedroom. It reads, "The wise who look inward, they get permanent peace, not others. One should accept whatever comes one's way without losing heart."
He left another message on his office table, carved into the wooden paperweight. "If you want to live, then learn to die."
And also in his prayer room, a framed picture on the wall states, "For the yogi, praise and insult are verily poison and nectar. The wise declare that insult is nectar and praise the gravest poison."
तमात्मस्थं येनु पश्यन्त धीराः तेषां शान्तिः शाश्वती नेतरेषाम् प्राप्तम् उपासीत हृदयेन पराजिता.